together this morning. This is supposed to be a lesson, a discussion. So I will try by all means not to preach, but to present to you, and then allow those who have contributions, whether questions or additions or subtractions or whatever contribution that is going to benefit us all, it will be permissible. So today we are starting, we are beginning a study of the book, Last Day Events. Last Day Events, this is a compilation of the writings of Ellen White on the last day events. So today we are supposed to cover chapter 1, which is entitled Earth's Last Crisis. Earth's Last Crisis. That is our study for today, chapter 1. So if you have got the Ellen White Estate with you, or you have the book Last Day Events, whether in hard copy or soft copy, it will be good for you to open the chapter 1, so that as we move, you can then contribute and ask where we have questions. Earth's last crisis. So I was trying to check. I learned a new English word, Nasi. What is the plural for crisis? I thought it's crises. So when I Googled, Google says the plural for crisis is crisis with an E, crisis, CRISES. So I want to ask a question as I start. What is a crisis? What is our understanding of the word crisis? Because our topic is saying Earth's last crisis. What is a crisis? That is my question. Anyone who can define for us a crisis? Anyone? What is a crisis? Is there anyone who can help us with the definition of the word crisis? Okay, I assume you are. Okay, yes, wonderful.
Maybe I'll attempt to define crisis. Maybe I would say it's a challenge.
Okay.
Maybe that's a close way that I can find for crisis. Maybe it's a challenge.
Okay, challenge. Okay, anyone else?
A time of intense difficulty or danger. That's the dictionary definition of crisis. So it's intense difficulty.
Intense difficulty and danger. An emergency situation. It's a time when difficult or important life and death decisions have to be made. It's a crisis. Another dictionary definition says it's an event or period that may lead to an unstable and dangerous situation. Another one says it's a stage in a sequence of events at which the trend of all future events is determined for better or for worse. Saka ndiri kutaura a crisis haisi a walk in the park. It is a very difficult, intensely difficult time, a dangerous time, a time where life and death decisions are made. Saka tikastada in history is quite interesting. If we study history towards that different crises that arose at different periods of time. Ever since the fall of Adam, we can study a lot of them. We can study events like the World War I, where history tells us that over 40 million people died in World War I. We can study events like World War II, where over 75 million people in total died. We can study about the HIV/AIDS pandemic at its peak between 2005 to 2012, where 36 million people died. We can study in the 4th century during the time of Luther, pakaita the Black Death pandemic, where 75 to 200 million people died. We can study about the Dark Ages, 538 to 1798 AD, where an estimated 50 million to 60 million Christians perished. Sakama crisis, all these were intensely difficult seasons where life and death issues were at stake. Saka now our topic, last day events chapter 1 is saying the last great crisis, the Earth's last crisis. The topic itself, there have been different crises throughout the history of humanity, but there is one that is coming, which is the last and the greatest of them all. Which means if it's a time of intense difficulty and danger that is coming, all humanity needs to know and all humanity needs to prepare for it. Now, I want us to read Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. If you read last day events chapter 1, the key text that is used to introduce this theme here, the last great crisis, is Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. So let's read Daniel 12, verse 1. It says, and at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was, since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found written in the book. So that is Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, which is our key text for Earth's last crisis. And it's telling us that there is an event which is coming, which the text is designating as the time of trouble, such as never was. So according to this text, there have been times of trouble ever since Genesis chapter 3 up to today. And the whole history of humanity, we know it's sandwiched between Genesis chapter 3 and Revelation chapter 22. My times of trouble, which have been there during this period, are less in gravity compared to the last crisis that is coming. It's a time of trouble such as never was. And the text, typa a timeline. Kuti time of trouble, when does it come? It says, at that time shall Michael stand up. So there's the standing up of Michael. Immediately after the standing out of Michael, there's a time of trouble such as never was. And after that, there is deliverance of God's people. And not just God's people, but everyone found written in the book. Which means this text is actually inverted in the sense that, firstly, there is a writing of the names in the book of life. And when the writing of the names in the book of life is completed, Michael then stands up. As Michael stands up, then a time of trouble begins. And as the time of trouble has begun, then God's people who had been written in the book prior to the standing up of Michael are delivered. Then verse 2 tells us about the resurrection. So that is our key text. Now, when we read last day events, page 12, paragraph 1, it says the prophecies of the 11th of Daniel have almost reached their final fulfillment. So tichitanga kuverenga this chapter, we are introduced to this thought which says the prophecies of the 11th of Daniel have almost reached their final fulfillment. So we have read Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, and last day events chapter 1 is telling us, Kuti, my prophecies of the 11th of Daniel have almost reached their final fulfillment, which means this statement is pointing to the last verses of Daniel chapter 11, which introduce us to the first verse of Daniel chapter 12. So for us to understand the Earth's last crisis in Daniel 12, verse 1, there is need to understand the last verses of Daniel chapter 11. Page 12 of last day event says, we are on the very verge of the time of trouble, and perplexities that are scarcely dreamed of are before us. Perplexities that are scarcely dreamed of are before us. Saka, for us to understand this crisis, as I said, it is important that we understand the last verses of Daniel chapter 11. Now, I was just looking at the last verse of Daniel chapter 11, which is from verse 40 to verse 45. And as I was reading them, I managed to understand about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. About 10 aspects or 10 parts of this crisis. There are 10 parts to this crisis that we find in Daniel chapter 11, verse 40 to 45, so that we can understand chapter 12, verse 1. So I just want to briefly go through that. I'm not doing an exegetical exposition of Daniel chapter 11, 40 to 45. I'm merely pointing out waymarks that are there that help us to define or to understand this crisis. Now, when you read Daniel chapter 11, verse 40, inotanga with a military crisis. So the first feature or first characteristic of this last crisis that is coming is that it is a military component. It's a military crisis. Military crisis. If you read verse 40, at the time of the end, shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. So verse 40, it could represent a military battle, a military crisis between two kings. Whatever these kings represent, it's not our concern at the moment. We just want the aspect. Daniel chapter 11, verse 40 is telling us that the earth's last crisis is a military component. There is a military crisis. And that is in tandem with Last Day Events, page 12, which says the world is stirred with the spirit of war. So if you start the chapter 1 of Last Day Events, it is clear that the last crisis which is coming upon the earth also involves war. Nations will be fighting. And Jesus akazvitaura kuna Matthew chapter 24, where he was saying kingdom shall be against kingdom and nation against nation. And he says we shall hear of wars and the rumors of wars. So the first point that I want us to understand is Earth's last crisis is a military component. It's a military crisis. It involves a war of armaments. Number two, when you go to Daniel chapter 11, verse 41, it tells us again the second component of the crisis, which is a church-state crisis. Church-state crisis. Verse 41, it says, he, that is that king, shall enter into the glorious land. Now, when you are studying the book of Daniel and you hear the mention of the glorious land always refers to a land. Okay, how do I say this without being too elaborate? Glorious land always refers to a land where God puts his people for them to be safe from religious persecution. So the glorious land always has a religious aspect to it that defines it. And verse 41 is saying, this king is going to overcome the glorious land. The glorious land, that's a religious land, and the king himself is a political entity. So this is a church-state crisis in verse 41, where we are seeing a religious political entity overcoming the glorious land, which is a land where God has set up as a land of religious sanctuary for his people who are being persecuted. So that's a church-state crisis. Verse 43, we are introduced to another component of the crisis. It says, but he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver. So whosoever this power is, in Daniel chapter 11, in the closing verses of chapter 11, this power has got control over the economies, world economies. He has got power over treasures of gold and silver, which means it's an economic crisis. So we've got a military crisis in verse 40. We have got a church-state crisis in verse 41. We have got an economic crisis in verse 43. The other one, we find it in verse 41 again. It says, ye shall enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. Many countries shall be overthrown. Verse 42 again, he shall stretch forth his hand upon the countries. So whosoever this power is going to overcome many countries, which means when many countries are being overcome, we have a Republican crisis. What is a Republican crisis? Republicanism is a form of government where the power rests with the people. But when one power overcomes all countries, it means power is no longer with the people, but power is now with the powers that be. So that's a Republican crisis. So verse 41 and verse 42 of Daniel chapter 11 are telling us that a time is coming when countries are going to lose their sovereignty and their republican form of government, and a certain power is going to rule over them, and there's going to be a republican crisis. So Daniel 11, 41 and 42 are pointing to a time when there is going to be a constitutional crisis, where the constitutions of the countries of the world are going to be under threat, and they are going to be thrown down, and a certain power is going to rule over them. That's a republican crisis. So far we have a military crisis, a church-state crisis, an economic crisis, a republican crisis. Let's go to verse 44 of Daniel chapter 11. It says, but tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. So whosoever this power is going to be troubled by a message which comes from the east and out of the north. This is a doctrinal message that is going to be preached and is going to trouble him. So this is another crisis again that has been introduced, which is a doctrinal crisis. So the last crisis that is coming is a doctrinal element. There's going to be a war on doctrine. Let's move to verse 44. Verse 44 says, but tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. So we see the other thing that is coming in here is persecution. Persecution of the people who will be preaching the message of the east and the north. So this is a persecution crisis. There's a crisis that is coming, and it involves persecution. Verse 45, and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Now, when you read this text in the original Hebrew text, it doesn't say between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. It says between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. So this is this power standing between the seas, and the seas represent people, the multitudes, and the glorious holy mountain, which represent the church. So this power is standing in between the people and the church, so that the message that proceeds from God's people will not get to the masses or to the seas. So what crisis is this? This is a religious liberty crisis, where a message which is supposed to reach the people is going to be hindered by this power, so that the people cannot receive it. So this is a religious liberty crisis. People will not have the liberty to choose what to believe. They'll be told what to believe, and this power is going to stand between the church and the people. Religious liberty crisis. Verse 45, again, it says, and yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. None shall help him. So this power at the end is going to collapse. What crisis is this? This is a corrupt religious, this is a crisis of the collapse of the crisis of the collapse of a corrupt religious system. So there's a corrupt religious system that is going to collapse, and that is going to cause a crisis in the earth. Then we go to Daniel 12, verse 1. It tells us the ninth component of the crisis, the standing up of Michael, which is the clause of human probation. That's a clause of human probation crisis. Then chapter 12, verse 1 again, it tells us that then there will be a time of trouble such as never was. So let me go over the points again that I mentioned, which define the last great crisis, which you get from Daniel 11, 40-45. It has a military component. It's a military crisis. It's a church-state crisis where the church and the state are now combining instead of being independent. It's an economic crisis. World economy is going to collapse. The world economy is going to be in recession. It's a republican crisis. All the countries of the world are going to lose their sovereignty, and they'll give allegiance to one power. And all their constitutions which uphold religious liberty are going to be thrown down, and they will bow down to a constitution of this power, which is going to be in supremacy. Then we talked also about a doctrinal crisis. We talked about persecution crisis. We talked about a religious liberty crisis, the collapse of a corrupt religious system crisis, and the close of human probation crisis. Sakanta kutaura about the time of trouble such as never was, which is in chapter 12, verse 1. Chapter 12, verse 1 starts by saying, at that time shall Michael stand up. At that time. So it's telling us a timeline. It's saying at that time, which time? The time of Daniel 11, 42, 45. And you remember, we read a text from chapter 1 of last day events, which said the final scenes of Daniel chapter 11 have almost reached their complete fulfillment. So which means Daniel 12 verse 1, the time of trouble or the last crisis that is coming can only be understood in the context of the revelation that God gave us in Daniel 11 verse 4 to 45. And that revelation shows us that the crisis that is coming has got 10 components. So this crisis is going to be the greatest because all those 10 components are going to occur at the same time. Patanga tiri kuverenga Daniel 11, 4 to 45, these things were happening from 1798 right through to the National Sunday Law. But this time, when this crisis comes, all these 10 components will happen at the same time. That's why chapter 1 here to the last day events, perplexities scarcely dreamt of are going to come upon us. Before I move to the next segment, is there anyone with a contribution on what we have covered so far? We have seen the nature of the crisis: military component, church state, death of republicanism, persecution, doctrinal crisis, all those things that I mentioned. Anyone with a question or a contribution before I move? I hope we are together. So Daniel 11 verse 40 to 45 is punctuated with crisis, which reaches its peak in Daniel 12 verse 1. Okay, I'll continue. If anyone has a question, you can just talk anytime. So in addition to the 10 components of the crisis that I mentioned, last day events chapter 1 tells us 3 more. It says also this crisis will involve lawlessness. There will be great lawlessness in the world. It will involve judgments of God on the earth. Remember, Ellen White tells us repeatedly that before the National Sunday Law will witness the judgments of God through natural disasters. There will be fires that will destroy wicked cities like New York, like California, and other big cities where there's great wickedness. Fires will just mysteriously start and destroy property. This will be God judging. And the ultimate judgment of God will be in the 7 last plagues. And another component that we get from last day event chapter 1 is natural disasters. So lawlessness, judgments of God, natural disasters, and then the other 10 that I mentioned: military crisis, church state crisis, economic crisis, republican crisis, doctrinal crisis, persecution crisis, religious liberty crisis, collapse of a corrupt system crisis, and the close of probation crisis. So all these 13 components are defining for us the nature of the crisis that is before us. Now, the next segment that I'll cover that we get from last day events chapter 1 is God has always given warning before a crisis, and those who take heed are saved. So when you read in the Bible, there are many crisis events that came on this earth, and God has always been consistent in giving a warning. Read Genesis chapter 7 verse 1. It will tell you God was giving a message to Noah and his family, saying they should get inside the ark before the crisis of the flood came upon the earth. Read Amos chapter 3 verse 7. It tells us that surely the Lord God will do nothing, but he revealeth his secret to his servants, the prophets. Saka hapana crisis which comes on the earth without a warning. And history has always been repeated. A warning comes, there are 2 classes developed: those who heed the warning and obey, and those who do not take heed to the warning and they disobey. Those who take heed, they are saved. Those who don't take heed, they are lost. That is a consistent pattern that we see. And even in our time, when this crisis is coming, 2 classes are going to be developed: those who take heed and those who won't take heed. Last day events, page 14, it says the events connected with the close of probation and the work of preparation for the time of trouble are clearly presented. So these events connected with the close of probation. So close of probation, Daniel 12 verse 1. So my events which are connected with the close of probation are those events in Daniel 11, 40 to 45. And the text is saying they are clearly presented. Then it continues to say, but multitudes have no more understanding of these important truths than if they had never been revealed. So multitudes of people in the church and in the world have no clue whatsoever about the events that will precede the close of probation and the work of preparation for the time of trouble, as if they were never revealed. So this is a very unfortunate case, Iripo, and I'm sure amongst us as God's people, we are also ignorant, especially with regards to the work of preparation. We may know the delineation of events, pachaitika event, koya chakati, then Sunday law, but where we lack is the work of preparation, the spiritual preparation that we must go through. They are clearly presented. The other section that we are covering is entitled Rapid and Quick Succession. That's last day events, page 11. It says great changes are soon to take place in our world, and the final movements will be rapid ones. Final movements will be rapid ones. So this crisis irikuya, we should know kuti paichatanga kuitika, the events are going to be rapid and in quick succession. So we're not going to look forward to a crisis of 20 years. No, it's going to be a very short period of time, and then Christ will come, which means we don't have time at all. Once this crisis starts, National Sunday law painoiswa, my events are chatera, SOP toti, the world will be surprised. Jesu paano where time Jesu ano manifesta oya, it will be an overwhelming surprise to the world, because they will not be expecting. Panongoiswa Sunday law, Christ will come very soon after the Sunday law. Atina kuudzwa whether it's 2 months after or 5 months after or a week after or a year after. But what we have been told is the events will be rapid in quick succession. The other segment that we see in last day event chapter 1 is the agencies of evil are consolidating. Agents of evil are consolidating. This is page 11. It says the agencies of evil are combining their forces and consolidating. They are strengthening for the last great crisis. They are strengthening for the last great crisis. Saka, this statement irikubudisa a thought that the agencies of evil right now, all agencies of evil, they're actually combining and strengthening. They may seem like they are fighting. If you look at Islam, you may think Islam and Catholicism, they are enemies right now. But the statement to know, my agencies of evil, agents of evil are all agencies, are still in harmony with Revelation 14, 6 to 12. Every system in the world that is not in harmony with Revelation 14, verse 6 to 12 is an agent of evil. And last day events, page 11 is saying they are combining their forces and consolidating. And this we find clearly in the Bible. Revelation chapter 16, 13, and 14. It tells us that I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs coming out from the mouth of the dragon, of the beast, and of the false prophets. And then it tells us that these spirits go out into the world to deceive the kings of the earth. And verse 15 or 14, it then says they were gathered in a place called Armageddon. So what does it mean? It means when in a time when God has sent out the 3 angels' messages, the Satan has also sent out unclean spirits to gather together all the forces of evil, so that they consolidate and strengthen and present one block to fight the truth, to fight the church, to fight Christ. So they are combining right now. We may not see it, but it's happening. The other section in last day events chapter 1 is teaching us that last day events demand our attention. Study the books of Daniel and Revelation especially. That's from last day events, page 16, paragraph 1. It says, the solemn messages that have been given in their order in the Revelation are to occupy the first place in the minds of God's people. First place. So in our minds, the first place is to be occupied by Daniel and the Revelation. So for us to prepare for this crisis that is coming, there is need that we become diligent students of Bible prophecy. The other section teaches us that we need to study history and link it with prophecy. That is page 15, paragraph 2. We are to see in history the fulfillment of prophecy, to study the workings of providence in the great reformatory movements, and to understand the progress of events in the marshalling of the nations for the final conflict of the great controversy. So it's not possible for you to understand Bible prophecy without studying history. We have to cultivate a love for history so that we can use history to understand the future. Study history and link it to prophecy. Number 9, segment number 9, keep future events in the proper perspective. Avoid fanaticism and conspiracy theories. We get this from Last Day Events, page 17, paragraph 2. It says the mark of the beast is exactly what it has been proclaimed to be. So we will discover as we move with the book, what the mark of the beast is, but it's saying it's exactly what it has been proclaimed to be. Then it says, not all in regard to this matter is yet understood, nor will be understood until the unrolling of the scroll. Not all in regard to this matter. Which matter? The mark of the beast is yet understood, nor will be understood until the unrolling of the scroll. So according to Last Day Events 17, paragraph 2, it's saying it's not everything that has been revealed. We may know what the mark of the beast is, but exactly how people are going to receive the mark of the beast, what systems will be in place for people to receive the mark of the beast, how life will be exactly, we do not know the nitty-gritties. And most of the things we are going to know when they start occurring amongst us. Saka, Last Day Events is teaching us, while we are studying prophecy, we need to be careful that we don't go beyond what has been revealed. We should speak only where God speaks. Where God is silent, we should be silent. Saka hatifani kuita ma-conspiracy theories. Kutsanangura kuti saka vanhu vachange vachitenga sei during that time, mark of the beast achange ichita sei, how exactly is the system going to identify asina mark of the beast neanayo? We are not told about that. We just need to wait and see the events unfold. What we know is mark of the beast chi, how to avoid the mark of the beast, and how to receive the seed of God. That has been revealed. But other things that are not revealed, we should not speculate about them and create conspiracy theories. Then the last segment that we get from Last Day Events chapter 1 is there's a need of spiritual preparation. Last Day Events, page 15, paragraph 1, it reveals to us, Kuti, for us to understand the last day events, our greatest need is not a powerful intellect or understanding Hebrew and Greek or reading many books. What is our greatest need? Last Day Events 15, paragraph 1, it says, those who place themselves under God's control to be led and guided by him will catch the steady trend of the events ordained by him to take place. Those who place themselves under God's control, so this is a person who is under God's control, are submitted to the Holy Spirit, to be led and guided by him, will catch the steady trend of the events ordained by him to take place. So our greatest need is not a very deep theological understanding of last day events. Our greatest need is to be led by the Holy Spirit. And as the Holy Spirit leads us, my events can achitika in the world. We will catch the steady trend of those events. We will know when events that have been foretold by prophecy are being fulfilled. So you see in the world that we are today, there are people who study prophecy. When George Bush became the president of the United States, for example, there were Adventists among us who said, who were proving using prophecy, George Bush is the one who instituted the mark of the beast. George Bush came and went. And we had Barack Obama, the same movement again started. He's the one who's going to institute the National Sunday Law. He's gone. Came Donald Trump, same thing was said. Donald Trump is the last president of America. DHS said that National Sunday Law is gone. Now we have got Joe Biden, and the same thoughts again are circulating amongst us in DHS and National Sunday Law. So we tend to focus on things that are not revealed, and we tend to want to pinpoint every event in the world and try to fit it into prophecy. But Last Day Events 15, paragraph 1 is telling us that our greatest safety theologically is to be under God's control, is to be led and guided by his spirit, such that even when you are illiterate, you can understand and catch the steady trend of events. Last thought that I want to point to is that Last day event chapter 1 reviews character is revealed in a crisis. So this last crisis that is coming is going to reveal our characters. It's not going to develop our characters, it will reveal. So this is our time to prepare so that we may have characters that stand the test of eternity. This is the end of my summary of last day events chapter 1. I now open the floor for contributions, questions, subtractions, additions. Anyone who read last day events chapter 1 and you saw a statement that you think we need to consider, this is your chance. Anyone with a contribution? The church is silent now. I'm not sure whether we were together or I was just mumbling alone. Tanga tiri tese here. Has the church been raptured?
Hello, Mr. Matondo.
Yes, I was now afraid that maybe rapture is true.
Right. True. They're not left alone. I just wanted to read from last day events, page 16. It says, let no one feel that he is secure from the danger of being surprised. Let no one's interpretation of prophecy rob you of the conviction of the knowledge of events, which show that this great event is near at hand. So what I got from this part of last day event is that we should not get to a stage whereby we feel that we are secure from being surprised. You know, there's starting last day event, sometimes we may sometimes fall into the trap of feeling as if ourselves we are very much secure. It's just the world which is going to be surprised by some of these things we know and understand the whole timeline, such that some things may actually, if we have that feeling, some things may actually pass our attention without us noticing where we are in God's timeline. So as we begin the study of last day events, I just want to encourage all of us that even with all the knowledge of last day events, we should try by all means not to feel that we are secure from the danger of being surprised by what is about to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the contribution. Indeed, we should not be self-complacent and think that we are safe somehow. Thank you very much. Anyone else with a contribution?
Yes, Matondo.
Yes.
I also want to read from last day events, page 17, paragraph 3, just to add. It says, many will look away from present duties, present comfort and blessings, and be borrowing trouble in regard to the future crisis. This will be making a time of trouble beforehand, and we will receive no grace for any such anticipated troubles. Yeah, so we should not invite the time of trouble before it comes upon us. Time will come. What we need to do is to prepare to stand in the time of trouble.
Thank you very much. That's powerful. I think it applies to us in our time. I remember Ellen White at one time, he was addressing people who were starting to gather food during a time, gathering food, saying this is the food that we'll eat during the time of trouble, when we won't be permitted to buy or sell. So even in our time, that fanaticism can be there as well, where I have seen some of our brethren who believe in the message of country living, and then they prematurely move from the cities and go to Honde without adequate preparation. And they prepare a time of travel for themselves before the time. And then after a few months, they come back to the cities again. So we need not do that, to prepare a time of travel beforehand. Anyone else with a contribution? I don't know if there are questions. Anyone with a question?
I have a question.
Okay.
You during the presentation, you listed or delineated some crises that are going to come upon Earth, and currently, as the world, we are facing the crisis of the COVID-19 and the related solutions to it. So I just wanted to understand if we have maybe any revelation or light in the Bible, spirit of prophecy, if this is of course, we have the general description in Matthew chapter 24 that there shall be diseases which are going to come upon the earth. But I wanted to understand if this one is its significance, rather, if we have any light from God that we have received. And also, as you are listing there, the crisis that have been mentioned is health crisis linked to those in some way. Yeah, that's my question.
Okay. I'll quickly refer to Revelation chapter 16, verse 12, which says, "And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared." So if you study this text, it's pointing us to a time where the waters of the river Euphrates are dried up. And we know in ancient times, the river Euphrates is the river that provided economic support to Babylon. And when it was dried up, when Cyrus went in and dried up the rivers, he then overcame Babylon. And in our time now, the drying up of the river Euphrates also represents a collapse of the system, be it politically or economic, which then precedes the National Sunday Law time. So now, the pandemics of this time, be it COVID, be it any other pandemic, and all the crises that we can have, any recessions that we can have economically, have their part in drying up the river Euphrates. Because the whole world is being rallied up to a time where crisis accuracies are in the world, where the world leaders will then say, let's find a solution. And that solution will be to have a one world government. So we may not be able to point to a specific portion of scripture to say we find COVID-19 there. But what we know is COVID-19 and every other crisis in our time, be it health, be it economic, be it political, be it terrorism, be it whatever, has its part in drying up the river Euphrates and preparing the world to be on its knees. When the world shall be on its knees politically, economically, health-wise, when the world just kneels and says, we have suffered enough, that's when they will find a solution, and that solution will be in combining and forming a one world government. So I think the COVID-19 is playing that role as well, where it's preparing the world how to respond to a crisis situation. We know a crisis is coming, and COVID-19 is just a litmus test that just helps the world to know how to respond to my crisis. So what we should avoid now is trying to then pinpoint COVID-19 as having some special import that all the other crises of the past did not have. It's merely a drop in a bucket. It has its contribution in the final analysis. That's what I would say in response to your question. Then you also asked about health. Yes, health crises are also part of the final crisis. Health crisis, they are part of the final crisis.
Okay, I want to add as well. Okay, yeah, I wanted to add on the COVID-19. So you find that it's not just COVID-19. I was reading some of this past week. Bill Gates has now shifted his focus. So he prepared the vaccines and whatsoever, but now he has shifted his focus to climate change. So yeah, it's not just COVID, but there are a lot of crises that are coming, and as you have said, at the end should be just to lead people to get back to the authorities and say, so what is the solution to all this? So I think, yeah, that's my addition.
Thank you. This is like a husband and a wife who are heading to a divorce. Today they fight over burnt stew. Tomorrow they fight over kuti wasvina Colgate pakati. Tomorrow they fight kuti hauna kugeza. All these fights dziri kuitika. You can't say zuva ravanodivorce havakadivorca because we aisvina Colgate pakati. No, it was contributing to the final event, which was the divorce. So that's the same with COVID-19, wars anoitika, climate change, this and that, terrorism, Islam. All these are just contributing towards the final event, here the last great crisis. Okay, any other question or contribution? It's 10:57, so we need to round up now so that we don't waste the time of the preacher for divine service.
Hi, Mr. Matondo.
Yes, how are you?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Really, it's quite enlightening. I'm touched by the fact the last statement. I think before you opened the floor for comments, the statement you read from last day events to say in crisis, characters will be reviewed. They will not be made up during the crisis times. We review characters when there is a crisis.
Yes.
Right. I see the challenge that we have. When I say we have, I'm also including myself in that. To say sometimes we are excited about knowing events of the last day events more than the preparatory work that is needed. It's what I just want to say is, the question that I'm left with, or the challenge from this presentation that I'm asking myself is, how then do I prepare myself for that time?
Yeah.
It's one thing to know about the events that are coming. The next question that I have is, how do I prepare myself for that time? Am I doing enough today? And what are the steps that I should take? It's basic, yet very pertinent.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. That's a powerful point, because when you are in righteousness by works, legalism, it's easy to study prophecy, know my steps, my events, as which will happen, be able to state all the points. It's easy to intellectually understand without a transformation of character. Nyaya iripa transformation, nyaya iripa preparation for the crisis that is coming. That's where we need to focus on the most. So thank you so much for that comment, Tapi. Is there anyone else with a contribution before we close? Or there's a question that was asked about latter rain, which is saying, do we receive the Holy Spirit latter rain prior to the National Sunday Law? This question, we are going to answer it when we get to that topic. There's a topic in last day events, which is specifically talking about the loud cry and the latter rain. So that's when we are going to answer this question. So please, Auntie Mara, remember, Patricia will speak on that topic so that you ask. Okay, I think we are done. I will hand over to Auntie Mara